how a narrative is built, sometimes using stories in the short term of what's observations of what people see around them, so that slowly builds up to kind of be used by the state to push further action down the line along a certain sort of policy plan that they may be having. Now, I think in many ways journalism and the establishment narrative, they intersect and then they kind of diverge at some points, and they intersect again. And we saw this, for example, with Joseph Pulitzer back in the 1800s when the U.S.-American War was, U.S.-Mexican War was there. There was essentially, I mean, you could read about this many pieces of yellow journalism, as they call it out there, which kind of pushed this war to a certain point, and it actually ended up with material consequences for large numbers of people. But it furthered America's agenda back then. Now, it's that the Pulitzer Prize is given in his name is some may say it's a travesty, but others may say it's actually a continuation of the use of weaponization of information for narrative creation and for furthering strategic objectives of countries and international organizations also in many cases. So I think that what we have seen over the last several decades, especially as there's been an ideological shift from World War II onwards through into postmodernist thought, that has infiltrated in some way into the way people within the journalistic space operate and the lens with which they use to report on issues. And we see it coming in full force at this point when we look at this oppressor versus oppressed narrative, minority versus majority. There are certain lines that are drawn. There is a matrix essentially that says that, okay, when you report on a particular issue, you have to fit each character that you're reporting on or each group within a particular box. And then the story gets woven around this. Now, these are typically for human stories, but then collectively over a period of time, this creates a much larger narrative, which can be used for political purposes. Just a quick example, and I'd like to hear your thoughts, in fact, on this. You look at in the U.S., they have this Office of Religious Freedom, and they have reports, annual reports. There are citation loops, which you see in these reports. And typically they come from within the Anglosphere's media space, which hires people, typically from a country like India, to report on activities that are happening within India or any other country also. And these news articles keep getting cited one after another, and they get hyperlinked one to another. And then eventually you have 5-10 articles, which basically say the same thing except in a different form. And then it finds a way into an official government report on the condition of a country. And this is used sometimes to influence policy, international relations, and the way countries should be treated by other countries. And I think this is fundamentally problematic. And you're seeing more of this. And one of the reasons you're seeing more of this, I believe, is that information is getting more democratized, and there are multiple viewpoints on social media. This fundamentally threatens the hegemony of many old establishment media houses. So the way around it is to tighten the grip over narratives. Instead of actually allowing people to take their stories and bring them to these media outlets, they say what the story should be, fit all the characters within the matrix that I had mentioned, and then tell the people that, look, your view is wrong. This is what you should think.
Right. So no, it's I think you've made you said citation loops, right? And I'll link the video here for the audience. We discussed this in context of history as well, of academia, that citation loops are typically that psychological mechanism through which only one idea is reinforced. And I think Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who's very popular she's a Nigerian author, and she mentioned this, the danger of a single story, the way Nigeria or any other African country is perceived by the Anglosphere is so different from her own experiences growing up there. And I think that same problem afflicts us. And like you mentioned, that whole binary of this is what you should think. Now it's become very dangerous, I think, when you say this is what you should think, and if you're not thinking that, then you're wrong, and then you should be dehumanized and otherized, and your view is completely invalid. So I think it's taken a pretty dangerous step. But I would imagine, Surya, that it's you said it's more democratized now, definitely more decentralized, and somehow the narrative does not change. So what do you think is going on here?
I'd like to take the example of what Yuri Bezmenov had mentioned in one of his very prolific lectures. He said that the community, the journalistic community, is an unelected community. They take it upon themselves to report on issues, and they choose which issues to report on, and how much emphasis they want to place on each story, and what kind of reach these stories should get, and ultimately what kind of narrative should be created. Now, the pushback, as you mentioned, against this sort of approach is not happening within the journalistic space as much as perhaps many would like to see. How it's actually happening is it's happening through the ballot in the case of India. It's a rejection, repeated rejection of the narrative that the media has been trying to create for several years. They have no other way but taking many factors into consideration, the media narrative being only one of them that they're opposing. I think the public, when you're looking at hundreds of millions of people, they turn around and say that no, we don't agree with the version of reality that the media is saying that we live in. We know our own reality, and we're going to vote based on this. So that's kind of how they're approaching it, which is quite unfortunate because they don't have an outlet in the media space.
Do you think there is this insecurity about believing your own truth, that growing up in an education system that sort of demonizes an Indic conscience that then is reinforced by media, popular media, as well as mainstream news media? It's been decades since this has been ingrained, and then the U.S. is looked as a sort of savior nation, and that's where everybody wants to escape eventually. So, do you think that except for the part where ballots are affected a lot by your local culture, group, and whatever family atmosphere you grew up in, do you think that there's a certain insecurity when people are faced with facts? They actually go on to, well, yeah, our roads are really bad, and our politicians are really corrupt, and you're right, and eventually there's this insecurity that does not allow them to actually make their own voices heard and say that what, you're wrong. We've progressed so much, we've built so much infrastructure, we actually have free and fair elections, and apart from a few cases of post-poll or pre-poll violence, we have free and fair elections, we have government support, welfare schemes, and all of that. Is that something that they are unable to say because of a mindset that encourages an inferiority complex as such?
I think that when we look at the group of people who have this mindset, or who feel uncomfortable in talking about the positives that are there in the country and positive changes that have happened over a few years, they feel that for them, they turn around and say, "This is not the India that we grew up in." Many times. So it's a standard thing. I've heard this personally many times, and it's amusing. And I reply usually by saying, it would naturally not be the India that you grew up in, because the demographics have changed. The country itself is not, it's 1.4 billion people, 3 point something million square miles. It's massive. And I don't think anyone knows the country properly. And to say that this is not the country that I grew up in, of course it's not. And your version of what India is, or what it should be, it's not. If you live in if you come from a certain socioeconomic background, the change in your life and what you see around you is unprecedented. It's not something that has ever happened in the past, because if you look at the people on the other side of the socioeconomic system, they didn't have basic. They didn't have their basic necessities fulfilled. Now they have that. That is a massive quantum leap for them. But that does not matter to a large section of society, because these are invisible people. Majority of Indians are invisible to the top 10% or top 5% of India. So for them, what happens with the rest, with the bottom 95%, does not matter. So if any positive change has happened, why should they feel it important to report on? Whether they get roads, whether they get houses, whether they get toilets, whether they get an education or healthcare, it makes no difference. The only time it makes a difference is when they want to weaponize the numbers of a tragedy that the masses suffer for political purposes. That's the only time they rely on the people who they ignore. And right. This mindset comes from years of deracination, which has been kind of imposed and through a network of schools, through social media to some extent now, but also through search engines, through academic literature, through the feedback loops that you were talking about, and the citation loops that are there. So it reinforces that there is a certain class of people who have the ultimate monopoly over the truth, and they can choose what to present to the rest of the world. The lived reality of anyone else does not matter. And we decide for them what their lived reality is, and we will communicate that lived reality to people abroad. They will report it, and they will treat us accordingly.